The cold air pricked Elias Vance's face as he stepped out of his wooden house, carrying an armful of freshly split firewood. 72 years of life in the wilds of Idaho, among the towering pines of the Whispering Peaks, had made his movements deliberate and precise. Every line on his face, every callus on his sinewy hands, told a story of survival, not so much against nature, but in complete harmony with it. He was a man whose life had been carved from stone, and that stone had become his skin, his soul. The nearest town, where one might occasionally glimpse a few faces, was several days' journey away, something Elias preferred. He had long since found solace in silence, where days were dictated only by the whisper of the wind in the branches, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, and the distant calls of wild creatures. He had no use for idle chatter or the bustle of civilization. There was enough meaning in the simple struggle for existence, in watching the seasons turn, in patching a leaking roof, or repairing an old axe. His home, built from rough-hewn logs, seemed as natural a part of the landscape as the ancient cedars that surrounded it. He had built it himself, stone by stone, log by log, more than half a century ago. Every corner, every beam bore the imprint of his labor and will. Inside smelled of dried herbs, wood smoke, and aged leather, the sense of home. He rarely spoke aloud, except for muttering something under his breath while sawing logs or cleaning his rifle. His only companions were his memories and his unshakable faith in his own strength. Elias was a survivor, and the wilderness seemed to acknowledge this, offering its own kind of silent respect. On that frosty afternoon, when the first snowflakes began to drift lazily in the brittle air, Elias finished stacking firewood. His gaze, ever used to scanning the horizon, fell by chance on the edge of the forest. Something there seemed unusual. A shadow. At first, he thought it was cast by a branch, but it was too dense, too still. He straightened slowly, his blue eyes, sharp and penetrating despite his years, narrowing in focus. It was a wolf, enormous. Its twilight-colored fur, almost black, stood stark against the pale snow and dull gray sky. But this was no ordinary wilderness encounter, no mere beast as Elias had seen countless times. The wolf was not hunting. It looked neither afraid, nor aggressive, nor even cautious. It simply stood there, almost patiently, its head slightly tilted, eyes, keen, unrelenting, fixed directly on Elias's cabin. The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the rustle of snow. Elias felt a chill course down his spine, not from fear, but from something unexplainable, the sense that invisible laws of the wild had been disturbed. The wolf was not acting like a wolf, and that was unsettling. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching toward the rifle leaning against the porch wall. The wolf's eyes never left him. In them he saw not hunger, not threat, but something far more intricate, something he could not at once define, yet which rooted him in place. Slowly, as though pushing through an unseen barrier, the wolf took an uncertain step forward. From its throat came a low, muted sound, barely audible beneath the wind's wail, a moan. A sound Elias would have recognized anywhere. Not a growl, not a warning, but a deep, tormented utterance of suffering. The wolf's stance, usually proud and fierce, was now bent, almost humbled. It gazed at Elias with an intensity that outstripped the animal, a plea etched into its eyes, desperately human. That silent appeal stirred something long forgotten in Elias's stoic heart, awakening a faint unease, something he could neither explain nor dismiss. It was a summons, clear as a bell tolling in the winter fog, and it demanded an answer. What lay behind that voiceless plea, behind this strange behavior of a wild beast? And how would Elias, a man who had long embraced solitude and self-reliance, respond to such an extraordinary call? A chill, not solely from the biting wind, traced its way down Elias's spine. His hand, still instinctively resting on the cold steel of his rifle, felt the familiar weight of self-preservation, a lesson etched deep into his bones by decades of solitary existence. He had seen countless wolves in his time, fleeting shadows against the snow, wary eyes disappearing into the thicket, or, on rare, terrifying occasions, bold, hungry predators circling his livestock. Each encounter had been governed by an unspoken ancient law. Human and wolf existed in a delicate balance of respect and fear, hunter and hunted. This wolf, however, shattered that paradigm. Its posture, that low whimper, the unwavering intensity in its amber eyes, it defied everything Elias knew. There was no aggression, no bared teeth, no flattened ears, no bristling hackles. Instead, a profound vulnerability emanated from the creature, a quality he had never associated with the apex predator of these mountains. The slight limp in its left hind leg was noticeable now, a subtle shift in its weight, but Elias immediately dismissed it as the primary cause of its distress. A sprain, perhaps, or a minor injury from a fall, but not something that would drive a creature of such pride to humble itself before a human. No, the urgency in its gaze spoke of something far more critical, a burden too heavy for a lone wolf to bear. He watched, motionless, as the wolf took another hesitant step forward, its large paws barely disturbing the fresh dusting of snow. Then it turned its head, not to flay, but to look back towards the dense, snow-laden forest, a silent, unmistakable invitation. Its gaze returned to Elias, lingering, pleading, then back to the forest again. It was as if the creature was trying to bridge an impossible divide, to communicate a message that words could never convey. A strange, almost forgotten spark ignited within Elias, a flicker of curiosity that warred fiercely with a lifetime of ingrained caution. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to retreat, to secure his cabin, to dismiss this anomaly as a trick of the light or a desperate animal driven mad by hunger. But the wolf's eyes, intelligent and unwavering, held him captive. They spoke of a desperation that transcended mere animal instinct, hinting at a capacity for feeling that mirrored his own. He thought of old legends, stories whispered around campfires in his youth, tales of animals seeking aid from humans, of ancient pacts between species. He had always dismissed them as fanciful, romanticized notions, far removed from the brutal reality of the wilderness. Yet here, now, in the frigid silence of Whisperwind Peaks, this encounter felt like something ripped from those very tales. It was a challenge to his understanding of the natural world, a direct appeal that bypassed his intellect and went straight for something deeper, something he hadn't realized still existed within him. Slowly, deliberately, Elias lowered his hand from the rifle, though he did not release his grip entirely. He remained on the porch, a safe distance, observing, analyzing. The wolf, sensing his non-aggression, took another tentative step, its eyes still fixed on his. A softer whimper, more insistent now, escaped its throat. It took a few steps into the tree line, then stopped, looking back at Elias, its head cocked, urging him to follow. Then, the gesture that sealed Elias's fate. The wolf nudged a thicket of snow-laden bushes with its snout, pushing aside the heavy branches, as if revealing something hidden. It looked back at Elias, its amber eyes wide with a desperate urgency, then nudged the bushes again, a clear, unmistakable gesture. It wasn't asking for help for itself, it was showing him something hidden, something it couldn't reach, something that clearly mattered more than its own fear of humans. The thought struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't injured, not in a way that required his direct intervention. It was showing him a problem it couldn't solve alone. A lifetime of ingrained caution warred with a strange, burgeoning curiosity. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stay put, to secure his cabin, to dismiss this as an elaborate, dangerous ruse. This was a wild animal, unpredictable, capable of savage cunning. Yet the sheer audacity of the appeal, the raw, undeniable desperation in the wolf's eyes, chipped away at his stoicism. What if he ignored a genuine plea? Could he, Elias Vance, a man who prided himself on his connection to the wild, simply turn his back on such suffering, on such an extraordinary act of communication? The question hung heavy in the crisp air, demanding an answer. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air burning his lungs. This was a moment of profound decision, one that felt heavier than any he had faced in years. Against every instinct honed by decades of survival, against the ingrained prejudices against predators, Elias made his choice. He slowly, deliberately descended the steps, leaving his rifle propped against the cabin wall. It was a symbolic act, a fragile bridge built between two disparate worlds. He was disarming himself, not just of a weapon, but of a lifetime of ingrained distrust. His senses were heightened, every nerve alert, as he approached the thicket. He moved with the slow, measured pace of a man walking into the unknown, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of a hidden threat, an ambush. His hunter's instincts, though momentarily subdued by compassion, were still razor-sharp, a low hum of readiness beneath his skin. The mother watched him, unmoving, her gaze a steady, unwavering beam of hope and fear. He reached the snow-laden bushes, the branches heavy with their white mantle. With a practiced hand, he pushed them aside, peering into the shadows beneath. What he found there, nestled deep within the thorny branches, was a sight that tore at Elias's weathered soul, shattering the last vestiges of his stoic resolve. It was a tiny, shivering wolf pup, barely larger than his hand, its small, delicate leg caught in a cruel, rusted snare. The trap, old and forgotten, likely set by a long-gone trapper, had clamped down with merciless efficiency, biting deep into the pup's flesh. The pup's eyes, wide with terror and pain, mirrored the anguish in the mother's gaze, an agony so profound it transcended the animal, becoming a universal cry of suffering. A tiny, high-pitched whimper escaped the pup's throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated distress that twisted Elias's gut. The sight was heartbreaking, a stark tableau of innocence caught in the unforgiving machinery of the wild. Elias, a man who had hunted wolves for their pelts and to protect his livestock, a man whose life had often pitted him against the raw forces of nature, now faced a profound moral crossroads. His instincts screamed caution. Wolves were wild, dangerous, creatures of instinct and teeth. He had seen the damage they could inflict, the cunning in their hunts. But the raw, unfiltered plea of the mother, the sight of the helpless pup, bypassed all his ingrained prejudices, all his rationalizations. This wasn't about a threat to his livelihood or a rival in the food chain. This was about suffering, pure and simple, and a desperate, intelligent plea for aid. Could he, a solitary man of the wilderness, simply walk away from such suffering? Could he leave this tiny, trembling creature to a slow, agonizing death, with its distraught mother watching helplessly? The choice felt heavier than any he had faced in years, heavier than the burden of a winter's wood, heavier than the decision to track a dangerous bear. It challenged his very identity, forcing him to confront the deeper currents of his own humanity. He looked from the small, whimpering pup to the mother wolf, whose eyes, still fixed on him, held a silent question. "Will you help?" Taking a deep, ragged breath, Elias made his decision. He spoke softly, his voice a low rumble, not to the wolf, but to the cold, still air, a promise. "All right," he murmured, "I'll try." The mother wolf, surprisingly, did not flee. She watched him, unmoving, her eyes never leaving his, a silent understanding passing between them, a fragile pact forged in a moment of shared vulnerability. Both were exposed, both were taking an immense risk. He, by approaching a wild predator, she, by entrusting her most precious possession to her species' ancient enemy. He knelt slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, his old joints creaking softly. The ground was cold and hard beneath his knees, but he barely noticed. His gaze was fixed on the snare, a cruel, rusted metal jaw clamped around the pup's tiny leg. The pup cried out again, a tiny, heart-wrenching sound, its small body trembling uncontrollably. The mother wolf tensed, a low growl rumbling deep in her chest, a primal warning, but she did not move. Her trust, born of desperate need, held her in place, a testament to her profound, agonizing hope. Carefully, with practiced hands that had skinned countless animals and mended countless tools, Elias worked at the snare. The metal was old, rusted, and stubborn, biting into the pup's leg. He could feel the small bones beneath his fingers, fragile and easily broken. He had to be gentle. The pup whimpered and struggled, its tiny teeth trying to nip at his gloved fingers, but its strength was failing. The mother wolf remained still, a statue of watchful agony, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Each second felt like an eternity, stretched thin by the tension in the air. Finally, with a soft click and a groan of rusted metal, the snare gave way. Elias gently, ever so gently, cradled the whimpering pup in his calloused hands. Its leg was clearly broken, a gruesome, unnatural angle, and the fur around the wound was matted with blood. He tore a strip from his heavy flannel shirt, the soft fabric a stark contrast to the harsh wilderness. With surprising tenderness for a man whose hands were more accustomed to axes and rifles, he fashioned a makeshift splint and bandage, his touch light and careful as he bound the tiny limb. The pup, exhausted and in shock, slowly quieted, its small body trembling against the warmth of his hands. The mother wolf nudged her pup with her nose, a soft, reassuring gesture that spoke volumes. She sniffed at the bandage, then looked at Elias, a deep, silent gratitude in her eyes that transcended any words. It was a pure, primal appreciation, a recognition of an act of profound kindness. Then, in a gesture that utterly stunned Elias, bringing a lump to his throat and a sting to his eyes, she gently nudged the pup towards him, then stepped back. It was an act of profound, unimaginable trust. A mother entrusting her injured child to the very creature she had always perceived as a threat. A desperate plea for continued care that brought tears, real hot tears, to Elias's eyes. They were not tears of sorrow or pain, but of a sudden, overwhelming understanding, a breaking of decades of stoicism, a recognition of a shared vulnerability, and a universal love that bound all living things. The boundaries between human and beast, predator and protector, blurred and then dissolved in that single, selfless act. Elias knew, instinctively, that the pup would not survive alone in the wild with a broken leg. The harsh winter, the ever-present dangers, the struggle for food, it was a death sentence. He looked from the small, trembling creature in his arms to the mother wolf, who watched him with an unwavering gaze, her eyes still holding that deep, silent plea for continued help. He made another decision, one that would irrevocably alter his solitary existence, a choice that would redefine his world. He carried the pup back to his cabin, the small bundle of fur surprisingly light in his arms. The mother wolf watched until he disappeared inside, a silent guardian melting back into the dense forest, her presence a shadow among shadows. This was no mere rescue. It was the beginning of an entirely new life for Elias Vance, a profound shift in his understanding of compassion, trust, and the intricate, often surprising, tapestry of the wilderness. His solitary existence, once defined by self-reliance and the pragmatic demands of survival, was about to be transformed by the most unexpected of companions. Days turned into weeks, each one bringing new challenges and unexpected joys. Elias, a man who had lived alone for so long, found himself tending to the fragile life of the wolf pup with a patience and tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. He named him Shadow, a nod to his dark coat and the spectral presence of his mother, who occasionally appeared on distant ridges, a silent, watchful guardian. The cabin, once filled only with the quiet sounds of the wind and the crackle of the fire, now echoed with the soft thud of Shadow's growing paws, the gentle nuzzles against Elias's hand, and the occasional playful nip. Elias learned to mix a rudimentary milk replacer, to change the splint on Shadow's mending leg with a surgeon's precision, and to interpret the pup's subtle cues. He fashioned a soft bed by the hearth, where Shadow would curl up, a warm, breathing presence that filled the empty spaces in Elias's life. As Shadow grew stronger, so too did the bond between the old man and the young wolf. It was unlike anything Elias had ever known, a connection forged in an act of desperation and sustained by quiet, unwavering devotion. Shadow followed him everywhere, a loyal companion shadowing his every move, his eyes, so like his mother's, filled with an unshakable trust. Elias, in turn, found himself speaking more, whispering to Shadow about the day's tasks, the weather, the silent mysteries of the forest. The pup's presence softened the old man's weathered edges, bringing a warmth and purpose to his days that had long been absent. Occasionally, Elias would catch a glimpse of the mother wolf, watching from a distant ridge, a silent guardian, a testament to the enduring pact forged that cold winter's day. She never approached the cabin, maintaining the ancient boundary, yet her presence was a constant, comforting reminder that their shared act of kindness had created an unbreakable, unseen link. Elias understood. Shadow was safe, and the mother wolf, in her wild wisdom, knew he was in good hands. He was no longer just a hermit, he was a guardian, a bridge between two worlds, and his heart, once as rugged as the mountains, now held a tenderness as deep as the silent snow.